All right. Well, it is 12:01, and I just wanted to say good afternoon and welcome to Methods and Mediums Oral History Methodology. My name is Pauline Tennant. I am an immigrant, a settler, and a mum, and all of this comes to bear on the work I do as the manager here at the Center for Human Rights Research. The Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba is led by Dr. Adele Perry, who's joining us here today. It was established in 2012 and uses an intersectional lens to research and advocate for human rights and Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence. We work to enhance training opportunities and to connect with researchers and communities to develop and foster a wide variety of research that is informed by social justice. While we are joining you here virtually with all the technical hiccups that might come with that, we are all rooted in place. The Centre and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Inninewak, and Sininewak, Dakota Oyate, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We are governed by the promises, most of them unfulfilled, of Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act. We recognize that we have benefited from and continue to benefit from colonization, specifically of Treaty 1 lands, but also Treaty 2, 3, 4, and 5 territories. I want to acknowledge that Winnipeg's drinking water comes from Shoal Lake, waters that have been stewarded by the 4 First Nations at Shoal Lake. Sourcing Winnipeg's water from Shoal Lake led to Shoal Lake 40 First Nation lacking access to clean drinking water for more than 2 decades. We also acknowledge that access to electricity, such as that to power this webinar here today, comes from the north, particularly Treaty 5 territory, but also Treaty 1, 2, 3, and 4. We offer this land acknowledgement to recognize the multiple ways that settler colonialism interacts with other systems of oppression to deny the rights of Indigenous peoples and communities, including attempts to disrupt the oral traditions of Indigenous peoples and to marginalize Indigenous knowledge systems. And we also want to recognize the resistance of Indigenous peoples to that oppression. So we're here today as part of the Methods and Mediums workshop series. It is an annual workshop that explores different research methodologies and approaches to sharing research, all that works towards human rights and social justice. This year, our workshop series was made possible with funding from the Faculty of Law Endowment Fund. In the past, we've been fortunate to host workshops on topics such as the archives, graphic novels, Indigenous feminism, and community-based research as just a few examples, some of which can be found on our resource hub. The idea of an oral history workshop has been something that has been requested many times, and so we are thrilled to be here today. Before we move to Dr. Janis Thiessen's presentation, I just wanted to give some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captions have been enabled and are available for you to use. Our chat function is disabled, but following the presentation, we will use the Q&A function just at the bottom on most Zoom screens, and we invite you to hold off until Dr. Thiessen's presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Janis Thiessen, who is a professor of history at the University of Winnipeg and the author of several books that use oral history as methodology, including Snacks, A Canadian Food History, and my favorite title, Manitoba. Her oral histories are archived at the University of Winnipeg Oral History Centre, the Mennonite Heritage Archives, and the Mennonite Archives of Ontario. And so with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Thiessen, to thank everyone who has joined us today, and to welcome you to the Methods and Mediums Oral History Methodology Workshop.
Oh, thanks all. Appreciate the invitation to be with you here today. As you've heard, I'm Janis Thiessen. I'm just setting up my slideshow here, which is being weird, but it'll be fine. Oh, and now I have the notes. The notes that wouldn't show earlier now happily showing. So hopefully you can see the screen, but not my notes. I'm Janis Thiessen. I'm professor of history at the University of Winnipeg. My research areas are food history, labor history, sometimes Mennonite history, sometimes all of those all at the same time. I'm the descendant of generations of Mennonites who've been active participants in settler colonial projects on two continents, and I've been working out what that means for me in my own research and life. And as for oral history, I've been using it as a methodology for 30 years. And I want to emphasize that what I share today reflects my experience, what I've learned, what has and hasn't worked for me. It's not meant to be prescriptive or limiting. There might be as many methods of oral history as there are oral historians. Um, but with that said, let's get right into it. So, what is oral history? There's a common joke among historians that the answer to any question is, well, it's complicated. And that is true here too. So I want to share a couple of quotes from a couple of my favorite oral historians. The first one is from Linda Shopes. Linda Shopes is an American scholar who's done a lot to write in very straightforward, practical terms about how do you use oral history as an historian, as a writer. So she has a piece called Making Sense of Oral History that has been republished online on Oral History in the Digital Age, a website affiliated with the Oral History Association, the American group that involves many Canadians because there is no Canadian equivalent any longer. She says the following: oral history is a maddeningly imprecise term. It's used to refer to formal, rehearsed accounts of the past presented by culturally sanctioned tradition bearers, what sometimes is also called oral tradition, uh, to informal conversations about the old days among family members, neighbors, or coworkers, to printed compilations of stories told about past times and present experiences, and to recorded interviews with individuals deemed to have an important story to tell. End of quote. And there is, of course, overlap among all of those categories. So what exactly is oral history? Well, it's oral, it's conversation, but it's also not actually just a recorded conversation. So another one here, this is from a fan favorite of oral historians. This is Alessandro Portelli. Um, Portelli is an Italian scholar of English literature who in the late 20th century became famous among oral historians for applying literary analysis techniques to oral histories. There's been a lot of writing over the past century about how do you do oral history? What kinds of questions do you ask? What are the ethics and the copyright and the legal questions of oral history? And of course, tons about what about the technology of oral history? How does one record? Should one record? How does one save? Should one save, archive, preserve? But he felt he drew attention to the interpretation of oral history, and he has the following to say: "Quote: Oral history is a dialogic discourse created not only by what the interviewees say, but also by what we as historians do." By the historian's presence in the field and by the historian's presentation of the material. The expression oral history therefore contains an ambivalence. It refers both to what the historians hear, the oral sources, and to what the historians say or write. It refers to what the source and the historian do together at the moment of their encounter in the interview. And this is a quotation from Oral History as Genre, which is republished in the book Narrative and Genre. So uh, when we think about oral history and what it is, some of the things that we should be considering is how does oral history address broader historical questions? How is it more than simply a search for data unavailable in print sources? And oral histories can help us address questions of identity, questions of sites of meaning, and questions of memory, whether that's collective memory, a memory that's shared by groups of people who identify in various ways, religiously, ethnically, politically, It can be communicative memory, memory passed down from one generation to another in a family, for example, or it could be commemorative memory, ways in which nations or other organizations attempt to remember the past in a way that forwards the goals and aims of that nation or institution. So what is it? Shrug emoji, right? So many different interpretations and understandings of it, but it does involve orality. Yeah. So what about oral history then as a research method? Well, an oral history consists of an informed interviewer asking questions of an interviewee. So there's at least two people involved. And those words are carefully chosen. An informed interviewer, someone who has done some background research, isn't coming into this completely ignorant. And where it is not simply a recorded conversation where both are talking. One person is primarily the question asker, the other person is the answer giver, right? Um, Ideally, there's a recording of this conversation, although that also depends on the context and the circumstances, right? I have a retired colleague who has used oral history extensively throughout his career, but because of the individuals that he was working with, none of those interviews were recorded. He took detailed notes instead, and that's something that the community with which he was working preferred, right? So those two things. And then the third, you need ideally an archive, a place where these things are found. So, and ideally together with the recording of the oral history interview, there are print documents that make that recording accessible to researchers. So a transcript, a summary, an index, metadata, all contextualized within an archive or a library. So there's no one right way to do this, but the Oral History Association has suggestions of best practices, and I hope that if I click on this, it opens up a screen that you can see, or are you still with my slides? Can you see the...
We are still with your slides.
Oh, sadness. All right.
I can pop it in the chat though.
That'd be great. Thank you. I will throw this link in there and go, nope. I'll throw that link in the chat for you. Sorry. Thank you. So, the Oral History Association has a collection of best practices for you to consider. They are suggestions. Every nation has different laws regarding oral history. Every nation has institutions within it with different policies and requirements. Universities in the United States, it's largely fast and loose. You can do what you want. You don't really need to consult an ethics board at your university. There are best practices, but no one's really checking. At the other end of the spectrum would be places like Great Britain, where because of legislation regarding privacy, archivists have for the last several years been going through their oral history collections, and this is particularly a problem with the British Library, which has an amazing and huge collection of oral history interviews. They need to go through all those interviews to see, not just confirm that the person interviewed gave permission for the archiving of their interview and its dissemination in whatever ways they agree to, but also any individual that interviewee names is fine and cool with all that happening with someone else's discussion of aspects of their life. So you can see how that becomes a very complicated situation for them. Within Canada, we're a little bit in between, in that we don't have quite that same legislation, national legislation requiring us to go through archived oral history collections to make sure that people named also consent to the archiving of their information. But we do have something that I'll speak about in a bit, the Tri-Council policy which requires us on research ethics, which requires certification for anyone using oral history as a methodology within universities. Um, so we'll talk about that in a moment, but things to consider with respect to best practices generally, and you'll find more detail with that link with the Oral History Association. The question of shared authority and reciprocity. So the reason for laws being passed, for best practices being generated, for ethics being a discussion within oral history is because oral historians have not been particularly ethical at various points in the past, and it's been a very extractive methodology, particularly with communities of power exerting that authority on uh, historically disadvantaged groups. And so to attempt to address that extractive process where you go in, you take knowledge that is not necessarily for you, and then go and do what you want, including build a career, make money, sell books. The question is, how do you deal with the fact that these oral history interviews are in fact co-creations between the interviewer and the interviewee? How do you share the authority of uh, that practice itself? How do you engage in reciprocity? And there are ways to do that, but we'll talk about that a little bit too in a moment. Other things to consider: informed consent. Uh, the folks that you're talking to need to know how exactly you're going to be using that interview, why you're the one doing it, what the potential harms are, including harms that they may not be able to foresee themselves. So those are thoughts that you're going to have at the very beginning of your oral history project if you choose to do one. And then the informed consent also includes the right to refuse or withdraw. So at any point during the interview, they have the right to refuse to answer a question. And that doesn't mean ask the question again in a slightly different or, pushier manner, right? The right to refuse, and then also the right to withdraw. And that can happen during the interview, that can happen, 50 years after the interview. So when it comes to the archiving of an interview, the person who was interviewed has the right to withdraw it from the archive at any point in time. Of course, if that interview has been used for publications, those publications are out there, and that's just how that is. But in terms of the then ongoing use of that interview, uh, that is something that they can have control over too in terms of withdrawal. Other things to consider with respect to best practices: how are you going to store this interview? Um, it used to be a question of, well, I'll just lock up my cassette tapes, but now they are digital recordings. And how are you going to store them in a way that is safe and protected from the cloud? How are you going to store them so that you have backups if you need to have backups? You should have backups in case of, accidental loss by the gremlins that exist within all our machines. And then too, what about destruction? Uh, if you have someone who has agreed to be interviewed, but they have not agreed to have that interview archived anywhere, what's your methodology for ensuring, what's your practice for ensuring that those interviews will be destroyed in a timely manner, right? Other things to consider with respect to best practices: the question of anonymity, and that one has changed dramatically over the 30 years that I've been engaged in oral history. It used to be an option that I would give on consent forms. Would you prefer that, you remain anonymous for this interview? And then I would simply scrub out not only the name, but also other details that might help to identify that person. Anonymity is something that we no longer here at the University of Winnipeg or with the Oral History Center offer at all as an option. And part of that is because of the impossibility of guaranteeing anonymity. Um, if you're going to remove names and try and scrub out details, it's particularly if, a place as small as Winnipeg, uh, or even smaller communities, it becomes impossible to do so in a way that you can guarantee that no one's going to be able to in the future listen to this interview and go, oh, I know actually who that is. Never mind, the question of recognizing their voice in the recording, right? So People who prefer to remain anonymous are people that I prefer not to interview, just because it's an unsafe situation and where I cannot guarantee that that is something that will happen. And then other things to consider, the question of why are you doing these interviews? Do you actually need to do oral histories? Could you just, if you only have a single question, can you just email your question, right? Or maybe those interviews have already been done. Um, so take a look through the archives and see whether there are already existing collections. And then the last question perhaps to consider is why are you the one who should be doing these oral histories? Um, is it even your business, right? There are some knowledges that are not mine to know, and I am not the best placed person to engage in that oral history. Maybe it is someone else's job to do those oral histories, right? So the Oral History Association also has guidelines for social justice. I'll just again open up a link that you cannot see and pop it in the chat instead for you. So these are guidelines because increasingly towards the end of the 20th and early end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, oral historians were interested in capturing stories of events happening at the moment, with a view to preserving those stories for future social justice work. Um, so these are a series of guidelines that the OHA has developed with respect to that. There are some who might argue that any good oral history is an effort of social justice, but we live in times when we know that the academy, uh, the nation, the continent, the world contains a plethora of individuals of a variety of persuasions. And so social justice is not a guaranteed mindset of every historian out there or even every oral historian out there. But for those for whom that is of interest, people like myself, the OHA has some guidelines. Uh, one of the Many of the guidelines from my perspective are simply best practices for any oral historian, social justice oriented or otherwise. So some of the things that they say in this section are, social justice praxis moves at the speed of trust, empowering the narrator at every step. That's a thing that every oral historian should do. Is like the point of the interview is to respect the narrator. They're the ones that control the speed at which the interview proceeds. They're the ones that direct the flow of the conversation, right? Uh, OHA best practices for social justice, guidelines for social justice interviews there. They suggest that the interview should focus on the interviewing narrator rather than the interviewer, which again, no kidding. Uh, the power and authority should be shared at all stages of the interview, before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview. That institutional ethics are not the ultimate ethics, and not for anyone engaged in oral history with indigenous nations, indigenous peoples. You know that that's the case also if you've completed a university research ethics process. You know that that's a fairly narrowly defined legal and ethical system that does not necessarily incorporate OCAP principles, which we'll talk about in a moment. Uh, and then there's also just numerous problematic examples historically, such as Boston College's Belfast project that reveal the ways in which the state can interfere with or take control of oral history projects, even oral history projects that are social justice oriented, in pretty horrible ways that include increased state surveillance, arrest, and deportation. So it's not just an issue here of protecting the interests of the narrator, it's also protecting the interests of groups outside of that oral history interview. And again, that Belfast project from Boston College is a great example of that. The interviewer there, um, and this is a quote here from Democratic Progress, should not have released any of the tapes until after all participants in the study had died to prevent the testimonies of the dead from forming part of a case against the living, end of quote. So the Boston College Belfast project, this was an oral history project that some scholars there had done with respect to the Troubles in Ireland. And so they had interviewees who they promised anonymity to. And as a result, these were wide open conversations about IRA members' active participation in illegal actions, including bombings and, killings. And then these got into the hands, these were, opened up uh, by interviewers before everyone was, involved, who mentioned in these interviews was dead. And so as a consequence, criminal trials were brought against people named in these interviews, not the narrators, but those named in the interviews. And these interviews became part of the legal evidence. So anonymity, not a thing that people should be guaranteeing unless they are absolutely sure that they can do so. And I would argue you never can, right? The Oral History Center here at the University of Winnipeg offers workshops that provide a really great overview of what you need to do before an oral history project, during it, and after it. So if you're interested in more details about how to make this happen, they offer something called the Introduction to Oral History Workshop Series. It's 3 days of 3 hours each. You get to handle equipment and practice the things. I took it, well, 15 years ago when I came to this place, roughly. Well, I guess it was actually 10-ish year at any rate. I took it some years ago. And though I had already been doing oral history for a number of decades, it's always great to hear other people's perspectives. I learned new things that some of them would have saved me some time if I'd known them earlier. So the more oral historians that you can hang out with and learn from, the better your oral history methodology will become over time. So if you are at a Canadian university, this is a thing you're going to have to do if you're planning to do oral history. The beauty of it, however, is that having done it once and received your certificate, you then simply provide your certificate to every university ethics board anytime you're doing an oral history project. This is the awkwardly named TCPS2 Core 2022, the Tri-Council policy on research ethics and their 2022 online research ethics training course, which takes anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days, depending on how much training you need. It's a series of things to read and multiple choice questions as tests, and a successful completion of it then gives you not only knowledge of multiple ways in which ethics can play a role in oral history methodology, but it gives you that certificate that any university ethics board here in Canada is going to want to see when you apply for permission to do an oral history project. But as I've just said, they're not the be all and end all. There's also OCAP. First Nations and have their own ethics and methodology, which addresses the ways in which they particularly have been abused by oral historians and other social science researchers, other researchers in the past. And this is the principles of OCAP. So ownership, control, access, and possession. The community, not individuals, own the knowledge collectively. So when you interview someone who is a First Nations person, you're not getting that individual's knowledge, you're getting that community nation knowledge, right? So it is a collective knowledge. It's not enough simply to have the consent then of that individual narrator. You need the consent of the community, right? Community controls all stages of the research project. Access, no matter where the data is being held, the community must have access to that data themselves. And then possession, which, sounds like it might be the same thing as ownership, but the ways in which they differ is that possession is a little more specific than ownership. Possession is about the mechanism by which the community has physical control of the data about themselves. So those are also principles to take into account that may or may not be built into your individual university's ethics board may or may not, in varying degrees, be built into the TCPS2 process. So it is something that you need to consider in addition to um, those ethics requirements. And whoop. Uh, in terms of methodologies for myself, I have been introduced as a result of my involvement with the Oral History Center in past years here at the University of Winnipeg to a four-phase methodology by the German oral historian Alexander von Plato. Uh, this is this is a methodology that he developed when he was engaging in oral history interviews with Nazi perpetrators. So there's a whole other collection of ethical questions that arise or that arose for him as a result of doing that. And one of the things that he realized doing that kind of work is that you run the risk when you're interviewing a Nazi perpetrator of simply platforming Nazism. If you're asking questions and allowing that person to tell their story, are you just simply allowing them to tell a version of a story that allows them to promote Nazism, to whitewash their past behaviors? And if you, how then do you address that while still respecting them as people, respecting their experience, wanting to get that knowledge, but not, simply disseminate hatred? And so he developed this four-phase methodology. So the first is you just ask a general question. It's a life story-based methodology, so you're not going in just asking specific questions and then exiting. You're asking first, could you tell me your life story? The way I phrase it when I ask folks this is, can you please tell me your life story in as much or as little detail as you wish to share? And then you just sit back and listen. And depending on the person, depending on the context, depending on, you know, the particular day, even, some of them will simply give you a brief resume. I was born here, my parents did this for a living, I got married on date. Some of them will share all sorts of things that you didn't know you needed to hear. So I've had people share all sorts of fairly disturbing stories that didn't have anything to do with the specific research project that I was there to ask them questions about. But you get that this is part of what I mean by reciprocity and shared authority. You were there as the oral history interviewer wanting to know certain things. They're there as a narrator wanting to share certain things. They're not always the same things. And you need to respect the fact that they want to have a certain conversation on the record with you, right? So could you tell me your life story is the first phase. The second phase, you ask questions of clarification. So you're still not focused on your own interests as the oral historian, the reasons why you did this project. You're just, okay, the life story has been shared. Are there any parts of it that are unclear to you? That's where you ask those questions in the moment. You make them up in the moment. Maybe there aren't any. Maybe it was a very straightforward and short story, but maybe they talked about incidents or described job processes, work processes that you're unfamiliar with, named a geographic region you've never heard of. That's the time to ask, what did you mean by what exactly is? Could you please spell, right? Phase 3 is where you then get into the questions of specific interest to you as the oral historian. This is, I usually have them boiled down to about half a dozen, have them on an index card that I carry with me so I can glance down at them. I don't ask them in an order. I'm not doing some sort of survey, right? You ask them in a natural way, depending on how the conversation to that point has gone. And that's why the index card, so that I can look down and see which of these questions is the one that I should be moving to next. I'm not limited to those half dozen questions. Again, it's a live interaction. It is not a survey where they're simply answering and filling in blanks, right? So if they say things that prompt questions in my mind, I will ask follow-up questions. But that's usually it can be one of the longer of the four phases, that third phase. The fourth phase is where Alexander von Plato uh, does the innovation here. The fourth phase is what he adds to a process that many other oral historians had already been using, and that is what he calls the conflict phase. The conflict phase. So this is where he addresses his concerns about interviewing Nazi perpetrators. He says that it's not ethical in his mind for him to interview Nazi perpetrators, simply accept their stories as presented, and then when he goes to write about those oral history interviews, dissect them, explain where they're wrong, where they were lying, where they were, you know, engaged in behavior that was terrible. Um, that should happen, he says, not behind their backs, so to speak, in print. It should be happening there already in the interview. So there is no feeling of betrayal or surprise. In a sense, it's also like covering yourself. But it's also a matter of ensuring that you are respecting the humanity of everyone, no matter how inhumane that person themselves have been in their past life. So uh, I don't interview Nazi perpetrators, uh, but I interview other people where indeed the conflict phase is of value, and not because I'm interviewing terrible people, but again, it's because if I'm going to then use these oral histories to write about these people's lives, and I'm going to start comparing them to other people who have shared oral histories with me, or I should compare them to written sources that I've read. It would be fair to start that process in the interview itself. And so, when I was doing the research for snacks at Canadian Food History, one of the questions I would ask in the conflict phase, if I was interviewing owners, managers, workers of in snack food businesses, was, well, at this time, there's a lot of concern about snack foods as causes of obesity, and there's a lot of blame for people working in your industry for causing all sorts of health concerns. How do you, as an owner, manager, worker in this business, respond to those kinds of concerns? And sometimes they say, it's none of my business, or sometimes they say, I don't. I think they're wrong, and they leave it at that. But sometimes you'll get lengthy, thoughtful answers. Another question that I like to use in the conflict phase is, and this happens particularly once you've done several interviews within the same context, the same project, you can say, well, you shared ABC, but I've interviewed other people, without naming them, who've said DEF about those same things. And how would you respond to their differing perspectives on what you yourself have just shared? So they can start to engage there too with trying to understand that there are multiple ways of seeing the events that they have shared, and understand that you will be doing some of that analysis yourself later on. So um, that's Alexander von Plato's four-phase methodology. This is a slide from Kimberly Moore, who runs the Introduction to Oral History workshop here at University of Winnipeg, and she talks about oral history as an archival source. So once you've actually done the interview and tucked it into the archive, what does that tucking involve? Two documents are required. One is the consent form, which your university ethics board will want to see before they give approval. And I try to frame that as a two-page document, a single sheet of paper, both sides. The longer that document is, the harder it is for the narrator to navigate it. So the shorter it can be, the more clear it can be, the better. But those things have expanded over my 30 years of doing them as we became more and more aware of the ethical and legal concerns, right? And as the requirements of ethics boards have changed over time. So you need that consent form. I always introduce that early on. As I'm setting up the interview, I'll email it to my participants. And then I will bring a physical copy with me to the interview and just go over it with them, ask them if they have any questions at the beginning of the interview. Then when I hit record, I'll just ask them to verbally consent to being interviewed, to verbally consent to the interview being recorded. At the end of the recording, once everything's all done and turned off, then I take out that paper again, and that's when we make decisions about whether they're going to sign or not sign. It's not till the interview is over that they're going to know that, well, I often say to them, like, we'll do this afterwards. You'll sign it afterwards because maybe you'll decide that you would wish that you had never met me. You won't know that till after we've had the conversation, right? So that's one of the forms. The other form that needs to be done, and this happens too at the end of the conversation, and that's the waiver. This is, again, for the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg, a 2-page document, a single sheet, double-sided, where they make their agreement to deposit that interview at the archives to allow the archives to then share it or not share it in the various ways in which are spelled out on the waiver itself. So that's the first way in which access is provided. Digital access. When I started, it was all cassette tapes. These things are both lovely and a pain. They're a pain because as you use them, as you listen to them, they stretch out over time. So every use of them ruins them. Right? Uh, and they are also so easily wrecked. If you're trying to transcribe from a cassette tape, you're stopping, you're playing, you're stopping, you're rewinding, you're playing, you're stopping. And that back and forth I've had more than one instance where the tape has come spooling off of the cassette and got jammed inside the recorder itself. And you just start panicking about it being lost, and you have to try and pick it out, and then it gets all wrinkled. And I also went to an archives once in which they let me listen to a cassette tape oral history. And again, this probably for those of you who are younger than me, this will not make any sense, but cassette tapes, those little plastic objects with the tape inside, they also had little plastic tabs. And if you left the plastic tabs intact, you could re-record over that cassette tape over and over as much as you wanted. But if you wanted to preserve the recording, you had to break those plastic tabs off. This archives handed me a cassette tape of an oral history interview done decades ago where they had not broken off the tabs. And I thought, you were one accident away from someone hitting record instead of the play button in your reading room and losing this. So we had a little conversation afterwards. I just, on my own, just broke them. I'm like, I can't stand this. So digital access is also something problematic. There's no magic media that is perfect. Digital access, digital hygiene mentioned there, you're going to have to constantly, as an archivist, check to make sure that there isn't, the slow deterioration of that digital file, also its corruption over time. And so you need to have a methodology in place for checking those things. Ensuring that you've recorded, and this is the oral historian's job, ensure that you've recorded in a proper file format. So don't record as an MP3, record as a WAV file, .wav, because it records far more data than an MP3 does, which is kind of a compressed format. So you need those audio files, you need the metadata, the context in which that recording happened, what sort of machine it was recorded on, all those sorts of things, so that the archivist can do their job of preserving that for you properly. And then you have how does the researcher get a hold of this information? So you have the transcript, the index, and the summary. So one of the reasons why some provincial archives are no longer accepting oral history collections is because they just get boxes of cassette tapes or file folders full of digital files and maybe no transcripts, maybe just a description of like who was interviewed and the date. And it's not great because any researcher now wanting to use that collection doesn't know what's in that collection other than the brief word, 5-word description of it. And so you have to listen to it all in real time to figure out, is there a nugget of information of value to me in this archived oral history collection? So the more points of access you can give to a researcher, the more your oral history will be used by other researchers, and the better it will then be, the more meaning it has in the archives, right? And the more respect you're showing to your narrator in sharing their life story with you, right? So the summary is a 50-word account of what this interview was, where and how and why it happened, and what the content of the interview is. So that's what gets archived. I have a link there in Maine, but again, I can't show it to you. So if you go to Maine and you look at the Janis Thiessen phones and you click on snack food and click on bun coups, I'm actually, you know what, I'm going to stop sharing briefly and try and share the something else instead. If you, oh, can I? Do you mind stopping sharing and then I'll try sharing something else instead? Thank you. I'm gonna attempt to share. Where is it here? Sorry. I'm gonna attempt to share something from Maine, the Manitoba Archival Index Network, which is online. So let me just see if I can share this instead. Can you see?
We sure can.
Awesome. And it says Oral History Center and it's Maine.
Yep, maybe if
Okay,
you could just maximize your screen a little bit.
for sure. Is that good?
Yeah, that's better.
Lovely. Okay, let's try and make it a little bigger. Hopefully you can see that. So, a collection of oral history interviews, all my stuff, the snacks collection, a sub collection there with just the candy people, and then one specific interview, the interview with Bun Coos. So this is how it appears in Maine. And so here's the summary. It's extremely short, just a couple of words. Bun Coos, Newfoundland. She worked at a company called Purity. She talks about her background, how she started working at Purity, her job transition over the years, etc., etc. If you then go and click here, what you get, hopefully you can see this too.
Yes, we can.
Here you have, awesome, thank you. This is the digitized interview. This is entered in something called OHMS. See down here at the bottom corner, University of Kentucky has developed something called the Oral History Metadata Synthesizer, where it links the transcript with, uh, well, the transcript and the index are linked together with the audio. So you can, here it's the index, you can see you've got life story and a partial segment and a segmented synopsis. It just summarizes in this section what is discussed so that you can search the index for a topic and it's like, oh, well, it's 5 minutes in, syrup is discussed, which, should be obvious because there's a whole section in the index labeled syrup, but it also happens here and here. And then you can play the segment.
50, 48, 50 people, somewhere around there. Yeah.
So the beauty of having, I hope anyone who's worked with oral histories will see immediately the beauty of having these two things simultaneously. The transcript is never a complete record of what happened. So, in this context right here, Bun Coos, she gives a huge sigh before she says how many people. those sorts of things are sometimes noted in transcripts, sometimes they're not, and they give you tremendous information about how to understand the words that follow, right? If they're laughing during a segment of speech, if they're laughing afterwards, if it's them laughing, or is it the narrator laughing, or is it both? These all give you some indication about how you should be taking the words. So the transcript alone is not ideal. If you can stop sharing that, and I'll go back to the slides, please. Thank you. Sorry about the awkward tech here, folks. Is that the screen now, hopefully?
No, we're seeing the Oral History Center, not the slides.
Okay, let's stop. Ooh, a stop share button emerged. All right, let's try this again. Slides. Yes?
There we go.
Okay, phew. Um, all right. So, whoop. Yes. So the advantage is that if you're wanting to look for something, you go in, you see the summary. If it's of interest to you, you can then go take a look at the index and see if there's portions of the interview that are relevant to you. And then you can take a look at the transcript and the audio itself. So it's a much more accessible way for getting at all this information. Almost done here, and we'll get to the Q&A. So how do you then, if you've done an oral history, how do you, or if you're not, but you're using ones that have been archived, how do you use this in your own writing? There's some lovely stuff. Again, I'm going to turn to Alessandro Portelli and Linda Shopes. So Alessandro Portelli has written this great book called The Death of Luigi Trastulli and Other Stories, Form and Meaning in Oral History. And he here uses the ways in which Italians remember the death of Italian steelworker Luigi Trastulli, who was killed during a protest of NATO in 1949. And he notices that the folks that he's interviewing about this event all remember this death happening on a wrong date. They all give the wrong date, but they all give the same wrong date. And rather than just, as many folks would do, going, shrug, people be remembering things wrong. That's how life is. He decides to start investigating why that wrong date in particular, and discovers that it's another historical event on that date. And the reason people are remembering that wrong date is that they are linking these two events in their minds as a way of giving meaning to both of those events. And so he comes up with in another famously quoted line from another source of his. He writes, "Oral histories tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do, what they believed they were doing, what they now think they did." So the point of oral history ideally is not just to find facts, right, that can't be found in other sources. The point of oral history really is to find meaning. How do people ascribe meaning to the events of their lives? And then Linda Shopes. Linda Shopes has a piece called Editing Oral History for Publication in Oral History Forum d'Histoire Orale, a journal that sadly no longer exists, but is still available online. She provides some really useful advice about how to edit oral history. She says, don't turn it into cutting and pasting quotes to corroborate your own point of view. Don't use interviews as some sort of, bunch of colorful anecdotes to just liven up your texts. Then you're not respecting the source. The source should be driving the writing, right? So she says you need to create a structure, work through the entire transcript of the interview to find sections that are relevant. You can color code them if you want. You can cut and paste them into whatever you need to do to find a coherent storyline. Get rid of anything that doesn't drive that storyline. And then you can use that to tell a broader story. So, and here's where the history part comes in. She says, you are needed as a historian if you're an oral historian, because you need to be giving this context, the history being presented, the method informing the conduct and use of oral history, and the theory underpinning the work. So you need the historical background. How do the does this oral history fit into a bigger historical picture? You need methodology. How was this interview conducted, edited, archived? And you need theory. How do you make sense of the interview? How did you understand the relationship between yourself and the interviewee? How do you use oral history to develop an oral argument? And again, different people do this different ways. One of the ways that I address this with students in my own classes, I use an excerpt from a book I wrote called Not Talking Union. There's a person that I interviewed in that book who told the story of her firing 4 different ways to me in the context of the same couple hour long interviews. And we were fellow Mennonites, and it was very clear as it went on that she was testing me to see how Mennonite I was and whether she could trust me with her story. Because the story was she was working as a Mennonite for a Mennonite employer, and she discovered that that Mennonite employer was doing illegal things. And so when she called them out on it, they fired her. But not quite knowing what sort of Mennonite I was, she didn't know if she could trust me to judge her for this and side with her Mennonite employer instead of her. So she first told the story as like, God gave me other opportunities. God slammed a door in my face, but happily he used my gifts in other ways. It was a very religious, this was a good thing kind of story. And over time, it evolved into her just, and again, unprompted, telling the story 4 different ways over the course of the interview. So one of the things that is needed is to, when doing oral histories, is to give people space to be quiet, to listen, and to allow them to, it could have been easy after the second retelling to say, oh, lady, I've already heard this, but I wouldn't have gotten what she really wanted to tell me because she hadn't trusted me quite enough yet at that point, right? That would have shut that right down. Uh, Another exercise that I use with my students is that I have them listen to an excerpt from an oral history interview, and I won't take the time to do this now, I think, if that's all right. We can come back to this in the Q&A if you're like, no, tell us more. But I have them listen to an audio excerpt from an oral history interview, and I ask them to find their moment of pause. A phrase I have gotten from Kimberly Moore. I'm not sure if that's hers or if she's gotten it from somewhere else, but it's a thought, a moment where you just pause and go, oh, I have thoughts, I have ideas. That triggered something in me when I listened to that. It reminded me of something, or it raised questions, or it made me feel a certain way. So I play students this audio excerpt from an oral history, and I ask them for their moment of pause, and I tell them that I didn't do this interview. These were student interviews that I sat and listened to, and here were my feelings when I listened to this interview while it was happening live. And then here is, again, I won't open it up for you, but here is the project that a student derived from that oral history interview that I would not have been able to do. So different historians will approach the same source material in different ways, and that is one of the strengths of history and oral history, not one of its weaknesses. So if you're interested in further reading, there's a lot out there, but these are some that have particularly resonated with me. So Portelli and a very simple handbook, Doing Oral History, a couple of Canadian oral historians who talk about the problems of working with, challenging stories. Winona Wheeler, who's talking specifically about Indigenous oral histories, which is useful for all of us here in Canada. And then Valerie Yao, what if you have the opposite problem that Fun Plato had? What if you're interviewing people where you're just like, you just love everything they're saying? That also can present ethical challenges. So thank you for listening to me today. Happy to talk about any of this in more detail. I hope you have questions.
Thank you so much. And maybe, so I just remind everybody, we have the Q&A function set up there on Zoom if you want to pop your questions in. And maybe while people are digesting this all, I can just ask you as well, we work with a lot of student researchers and folks who are maybe doing their thesis or their dissertation. How did you come to oral history?
Me?
Yeah,
Oh gosh, by accident. Oh my gosh. So I started my master's at the same time as I started my first job. And I should back up a bit. Before I started my first job, I worked 9 years waiting tables in a Mennonite small town that I had moved to as a teenager. And one day I wore my Winnipeg General Strike t-shirt to work. And there was a sudden tone shift between me and my employer, who I had gotten along with well for many years. And I suddenly realized that, wait a minute, our fellow Mennoniteness was not enough to overcome our class differences. And I started wondering, is this a question that is just specific to me, or is this something that other people have experienced? And so I decided to look at other Mennonite-owned workplaces when I started my master's, and the Mennonite-owned workplaces with primarily Mennonite workforces, to see if something similar had ever manifested there and how they had dealt with it historically. And because these were privately owned businesses, there weren't a lot of public records out there, you know. So the only way to really get at that was to interview owners and managers and workers in those businesses.
that's amazing. Um, and so our Q&A is still open, and I hope you don't mind, but I do have another question.
Sure.
You chatted a little bit about that decision to do or not do an oral history, and sometimes being the right person and not the right person to tell it. And I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit, as folks might be considering this as a methodology.
Yes. I mean, there's no, again, hard and fast rules, and every person has to make that decision for themselves. Um, there are advantages to being an insider when doing an oral history, and there are advantages to being an outsider when doing oral history. So a Mennonite interviewing fellow Mennonites can be both good and bad. Uh, but whether you're an insider or an outsider to the community who you're studying and who you're researching, there's always going to be questions of well, it can go well or badly. Like by being a member of the community, you know the kinds of questions perhaps that need to be asked. You know where the bodies are buried, so to speak, right? But by being an outsider, you bring a perspective that you don't, that isn't always had. So that's a question to consider. Am I a part of this group? Should someone who is part of this group, should they be the ones to do these interviews? And then where the question of shouldn't uh, comes in, like maybe it shouldn't be me. For me, that comes in when it comes to issues of power. So a Mennonite or a non-Mennonite interviewing Mennonites in a Canadian context, the Canadian Mennonite community, uh, and I'm talking here, there's many Canadian Mennonite communities, but the mainstream ones, let us say, the ones who are not distinguishable visibly by dress or by relationship to technology. These are not communities that are disadvantaged historically in the present day. There's not a power differential between uh, them and a non-Mennonite oral historian. So it doesn't become problematic. Where I'm interviewing people who do not have the same power as I have, and that's of course affected also by the fact that I'm white and I'm a professor. There, I have to ask very much the question: is this my business to ask, or is this something that this community should be doing themselves if they even want these kinds of questions asked? And so, usually, I almost without exception, the kind of research that I do as a historian has been the sorts of things that began for me the trek along the path to be an oral historian, which is something that's emerged in my own life that I want to resolve by figuring out whether history can provide any answers or any solace, right? Or any hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question here that says, in terms of methodology and interpretation, is narrative inquiry and oral history different?
You know, this is a good question, and I'm going to say something in response that may not be helpful. And that is, I think there is sometimes folks are really keen on labels as a way of trying to distinguish themselves from others, or they're really keen on labels as a way to create a publication path for themselves that wouldn't otherwise exist. And maybe these theoretical differences really matter to some folks, but I'm not a theorist. I'm just someone who tries to use whatever theories will get whatever job I need done. So for me personally, I don't know or care. Sorry. Right? Uh, I think part of it too is also maybe an historical question. Oral history emerges within the context of history, right? But there's others who are engaging in similar kinds of practices and methodology, but in different disciplines. And so they'll have evolved whole other conversations themselves that travel along parallel tracks, in part because these disciplines don't talk as well to each other as they might. So certainly throughout my career, I've had people say to me, "Oh, the thing that you wrote isn't history," and I, again, just fine, like, but don't care.
Yeah, the labels we add to things.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question here that's looking at sort of the ethics around the institution and the community. So the question is, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. You spoke briefly about the ethics and various considerations. And my question is related to university ethics versus community ethics and the tensions that can exist between those two. So as a grad student, this person was hoping that you may be able to offer some advice on how to navigate these pieces when engaged in your own research project, particularly to advocate for the community ethics.
Yes. Surround yourself with people who will support you. So I've had to go through university ethics processes at 3 different institutions over the course of my time as student and then professor. And the people on those boards also change from time to time. They're not, there for a 30-year stretch. So sometimes you'll find yourself having conversations with them that go really well, and they're right on board with your line of thinking in terms of the need for community ethics to prevail over institutional ethics. And then the board will change, and you'll find yourself having conversations that you thought you had had, a decade ago, and were all resolved. And what will what will take you through that is having other people to support you, both in terms of how do I respond to this question from the ethics board where they're suddenly challenging a perspective or a viewpoint, or saying that, their processes take precedence over the community's ideas of what constitutes ethical behavior. You need those people in your court to be able to assist you in responding in an effective manner. Uh, for some of us, we also need it in terms of like responding in a polite manner. uh, but also you need those folks to be able to join you in pushing back and trying to make change from within, right? So there has happily been increased recognition of the importance of OCAP. There's still a ways to go, and there are others who work more in the field of Indigenous history than I do. I'm only peripherally involved in that. And those are the folks who, if that's the field and if the community in particular that you're speaking of, that you need to find and read and show up at conferences with and establish an email conversation with, or find on your campus. And that can be fellow students, because especially for grad students, the people that you meet in grad studies, once you find your people, those are people who will be with you one way or the other for the remainder of your academic career, even if your academic career is outside of the academy, right? They're people you can continue to draw on. Um, so yeah, I hope that helps answer. It's tough though, for sure.
Mhm. An ongoing challenge, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just checking the time, so we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions here. We have a two-part comment here. So it's someone who is going to be embarking on looking at oral traditions in small villages in a country in Africa, where storytelling is the core of those traditions. And so this person is looking at the implications, the influences the research could have due to the thesis committee's eagerness for research that's unique. In other words, researchers are struggling with offering something that usually stressed as unique and has never been done before. But I just want the research to research what is my passion, even if it was done with by someone else and giving it a different twist. So in short, how much does storytelling um, can it suffer iterations due to university goals, which in terms can affect the ethical part of the whole entrepreneurship?
Oh man, a good question. So again, I can only answer from my own life, right? Um, Rightly or wrongly, I've never planned a career trajectory. I have just always studied questions that mattered to me. Um, and very much, as I said, looked at experiences in my own life that I had questions about, and wanted to know if other people have had those questions over time in other historical contexts, or within my own community more broadly, and seen and wanted to know how they themselves sorted them out, if they did, as a way of trying to resolve my own questions, or to, as I say, give hope, right? And so the point of grad school for me is it's a reward for undergrad. You've had the training. Now you're in grad school, you're getting some additional refinements to the training, but the training wheels are coming off, and you need to start charting your own path as a researcher and doing what you want to do. And the field doesn't develop if what we're doing is trying to fit everybody else's needs. You need to do what fits your needs. So I don't know that you should care too much about innovation and pleasing your thesis committee. I mean, to some extent you have to, right? Or they're not gonna, but uh, ultimately it's your work and your writing, and you need to find a balance between the desires you have to do the kind of work you want to do and the straitjackets that the institution imposes. And again, there too, like storytelling, yeah, it's iterative. And maybe like you might not have anything innovative. Sometimes simply all you can do is document. I'm just revising a piece myself just now, where um, no one's written about this topic in any substantive way for 20 years. And there have been some new source materials that have been released about this topic since then, but they're not ground shaking. They're not like upending our understanding of this. It's just, hey, here's a slight refinement, or hey, uh, the things that we know are still the things that we know, except here's the human impact. Here's how it affected a particular individual. And that's always worth knowing too, right? So um, do your thing, and I wish you the best. And if you have more questions, any of you within this chat, or if the answer I provided here doesn't quite get at what you were driving at with your question, don't hesitate to email me, ja.thiessen@uwinnipeg.ca. Happy to have conversations about oral history with anybody. Always a good time.
Yeah, well, I think as a follow-up, the person just wrote, those were the words I needed to hear. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think like those questions of this need for new research, when sometimes, as you say, the research exists and it's about amplifying and sharing that in different ways. And that's something here at the center we're really trying to do as well. So I see it's 1:15 and I'm going to pop some links in the chat as folks get on their way. But I just want to thank everybody on the call here today, to Dr. Thiessen for sharing their expertise and your knowledge and your mentorship with oral histories and methodology. As people are logging off, I want to acknowledge Dr. Adele Perry, Angela Cicerone, and Catherine Acebo for all of the care they took to plan this event. And just a special thanks to our speaker and to all of you. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you all at future events. Take care.